right, well, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us, both here and virtually. My name is Andrew Alton, the Historical Programs Manager for the American Revolution Institute of the Society of the Cincinnati, and I'm delighted to welcome you all to today's Lunch Bite. The American Revolution Institute promotes knowledge and appreciation for the achievement of American independence by supporting advanced study, developing exhibitions and other historical programs and tours, advocating historic preservation, and providing resources to classrooms nationwide that benefit teachers, students, and scholars alike. Since 1938, the Society of the Cincinnati has done all of this work from right here at its headquarters, Anderson House, a National Historic Landmark that was completed in 1905 as the winter residence of Lars and Isabel Anderson here in Washington, D.C. Today's Lunch Bite features Paul Newman discussing a manuscript orderly book that was kept by British General Robert Cuninghame from his time in command of an army near Clonmel, Ireland in 1778, and this is from our library collections. Paul is the Institute's Museum Collections and Operations Manager, having joined the professional staff here at Anderson House in November of 2021. But prior to that, he served on the interpretive staff of the United States Capitol here in Washington, as well as on the curatorial staff at the Regimental Museum of the Royal Scots Dragoon Guards in Edinburgh Castle in Scotland. Paul has a keen interest and expertise in military and American weapons, uniforms, and military artifacts, and that led him to this wonderful choice today for today's topic. So you are all in good hands. But before I turn things over to Paul, the usual housekeeping items are in order for those of you joining us on Zoom this afternoon. Following today's presentation, there will be a question and answer session, so please feel free to submit your questions for Paul at any point during the presentation. And as always, we will do our best to incorporate them with our live audience questions. Should you have any technical related questions or comments, those can be submitted by using the chat function, as one of our staff members will be monitoring that and will do their best to assist you. So with all of that and without further delay, please join me in welcoming my colleague, Paul Newman.
Well, hello, everyone, and good afternoon. For those of you in person, welcome to Anderson House, and for those of you online, welcome to the ether, including my mum. Shout out to my mum. So welcome. So I'm thrilled to be talking about this. It's a fabulous book. It's been a really lovely excuse to delve into something that maybe I wouldn't normally get the opportunity to, which is what we really enjoy, I think, as a team about our lunch bites. And it is really just packed with wonderful, colorful detail, which I'll give you an idea of, hopefully, in this talk. So as I've referred to it here, it's as an Irish establishment orderly book from 1778. With this exquisite green front and back boards. What exactly is an orderly book? So orderly books are a record of both general and/or regimental or unit orders compiled for the distribution to officers. This orderly book, though, is a very curious example. It is seemingly two manuscripts bound together in the form known in French as a tête bêche, which it translates to English as head to toe. Each end of the book is the start of a manuscript. Actually, the two outermost boards are each front boards, and each actually have their own titles to them, but one is a little bit pretty illegible, but they very much relate to the contents. To read what I've called Volume A, being from the front, as we typically see it, of the book. Volume A, one can read the book in a conventional manner. And then to read Volume B, you have to flip it over and then put it right side up. The contents of Volume A concern arrangements of broader or wider geographical focus and largely originate from the Irish capital of Dublin, which for the British administration was the heart of their governance of Ireland. Volume B consists of orders of a tactical disposition. In the main, these focus on the management of a camp near Clonmel in the southern Irish county of Tipperary. Looking at the two volumes together, the period they cover is from the 27th of June, 1778 to the 25th of August, 1779. The British Army in Ireland. Ireland had the peculiar position within the British Empire of being one part home territory, one part colony. With a history of conquest and settlement by the English beginning in the medieval period, it is safe to say that the relationship between England and then after the Union of Crowns, joined by Scotland, that relationship between England and then Scotland and Ireland was complicated at best. With the restoration in 1660 of Charles II of England and Scotland, units of the newly established British Army would serve in Ireland, having been financed from England and Scotland. In 1699, a separate Irish establishment was formed, whereby Irish tax revenues would fund those British units serving there. Now, whose orders do these two volumes bound into this single book contain? So they contain either those of the Adjutant General of Ireland or those disseminated by him. The person holding the position as Adjutant General of Ireland in this period is Lieutenant General Robert Cuninghame. Sadly, I haven't been able to find an image of him. There is reputed to be a Gilbert Stuart portrait of Cunningham, but I've been unable to find a representation of this either as the original painting or a later engraving. But the search for that continues. So Cunningham was born into a Scottish military family. He was educated at the University of Edinburgh before the Jacobite Rising of 1745 saw him volunteer for military service. Having fought at the Battle of Culloden with the 14th Foot, Cunningham, having gained the favour of the regiment's colonel, who would then become Lord Lieutenant of Ireland, would see this pivot from Scotland to then Cunningham really spending a lot of his adult life in Ireland. And he actually, in fact, married a woman who was part of the English, Anglo-Irish aristocracy, as it was known. Cunningham's adult life would be dedicated to service both within the army and the state, rising through the ranks to become a general officer in 1772, where he was, and then later made adjutant general, though my research has yet to ascertain exactly his tenure as adjutant general. And in 1792, he would be made Baron Rossmore. The year later, he would be the Commander-in-Chief of British Armed Forces in Ireland. As well as that, he was also an MP in the Irish Parliament and English Parliaments. But back to the book itself. As I studied these two manuscripts within the single bound book, I attempted to understand, was there something that made these two volumes distinct or affiliated? Eventually, I was able to connect the dots. I could see in volume A, we had an adjutant general, in this case, Cunningham, and orders tied with Dublin, and at times they were very strategic in their dimension. In volume B, Cunningham's orders focus on a military camp near Clonmel. What helped tie these two volumes together was an entry I came across in volume A, dated the 8th of July, 1778, where the Commander-in-Chief of Ireland ordered a sergeant and 6 men of the 32nd Regiment of Foot to report to Lieutenant General Cunningham's quarters over in Kildare Street, Dublin, at 5 o'clock the following morning and escort the general's baggage to the Clonmel Camp. So suddenly, these two volumes made much more sense together. These two volumes are complementary and together provide a detailed reference to British Army activities and organisation in Ireland during the late 1770s. And what will very much become a theme in this book, in these two manuscripts, is everything you want is there. Even an introduction to tell you what Cunningham and his adjutants are doing with this orderly book. So this is a direct text from the book, and I'll simply read it. The object of the present encampments being ultimately the defense of this country, rigid discipline becomes absolutely necessary to habituate the minds of the soldiers to regularity and to secure the inhabitants from fraud, plunder, violence, and oppression. It is therefore hoped that the officers, from seeing the necessity of it, will not only thoroughly submit to the following regulations, but will in their capacities enforce them on every occasion. So that is what an orderly book is about in a nutshell, thanks to Cunningham. Now, for the bulk of this talk now, I'm going to focus on the Clonmel Camp, which Cunningham seems to be based at, and as in the role of Adjutant General, though I don't have the full context to that as yet. So then that's where we're looking at volume B, which is really just dealing with the nitty-gritty of the camp, how it's managed and whatnot. So with a camp, you need tents. And again, fortunately, our friend Robert Cuninghame has put meticulous notes as to how one should lay out an army camp. In this case, he's describing how one should lay out a camp for the ideal regiment of foot in the British Army, which is more typical on paper than in reality. But anyway, it's a wonderful illustration. And he's describing, so an average infantry regiment on paper should be 1,000 men, 10 companies of 100 men each. And he literally spells out, okay, so there's going to be 2 rows of tents. There'll be officers over here. They'll be separated by X amount of yards from these tents. The majors of brigade will be gathered together in one part of the camp. There'll be trenches dug here. The artillery will go here. And the rows on, as you're looking at the screen, the bottom left, very much go line by line and measure out the yards between all of these. So it's just wonderful, wonderful detail. But who are the soldiers that were encamping here at Clonmel? At various points, you're getting references to specific regiments, and by and large, it seems like there's very much a consistency with this period of time and these regiments. But what brings it all together is this wonderful order of battle. Now, it's not to suggest that this formation went out into the field, but if this is the period of the French and Spanish scare, of an invasion scare coming into the UK and Ireland, of the summer into the fall of 1778, where you get the famous Coxheath camp being set up and things like that. Not quite sure, incidentally, if that's why this camp was set up. I haven't been able to ascertain exactly why this camp was set up. And certainly it's not of the numbers that we're talking about in some of the bigger camps that you get in England. But anyway, it's nonetheless a sizable force. And this order of battle lays out the several infantry and cavalry regiments who would be commanding, in this case, these 2 wings of the army and the commanding officers. In the case of the cavalry, we've got 4 cavalry regiments present. We've got the 3rd Horse, the 9th, 12th, and 14th Dragoons. And in infantry terms, we've got 6 infantry regiments. We've got the 19th, the 30th, the 32nd, the 36th, the 66th, and the 67th regiments of foot. And some portion of artillery, which isn't really broken down into any which way, that I found as yet in these 2 volumes. But certainly, this is you can see an ideal situation. So nothing's more important to a British Army base or camp than keeping order. And again, our friend Cunningham has put 3 pages of detailed general camp regulations that go through a host of activities and a host of that will affect different officers and different individuals within the camp. 3 that I've just pulled out were that I find of particular interest. The first of which is that no officer or soldier can leave camp without permission or a written pass, that no gambling is allowed in the camp, that no hunting or fishing can occur, and that no damage to the grounds of local inhabitants can occur without severe punishment. So between those 3, you've got the idea that it's being very strictly controlled where the British soldiers are going, and that they can only mix with the local inhabitants really with permission of their officers. That it's very much being strictly put down to the men that they mustn't damage the grounds and estates and the dwellings of local inhabitants, and the no gambling aspect is to make sure they're all on their best behavior. Throughout the 2 volumes, there are several accounts of court-martial proceedings. I'm just going to draw on one particular example from the 15th and 16th of June 1778 concerning 2 cornets, a cornet being the junior rank of the cavalry in the period, what would now be a 2nd lieutenant. And they are from the 14th Light Dragoons. Interestingly, the president of this court-martial was Lieutenant Colonel Ralph Abercrombie, who was the commanding officer at the time of the 3rd Horse. Abercrombie goes down in British history as the man that presided over the Battle of Alexandria in 1801, where he was mortally wounded, and what would be a key victory against France in North Africa. The 2 men under inquiry are Cornets Richard Galway and Henry Bambook. Now, Galway was charged with rioting in his quarters and acting in the prejudice of good order and military discipline. That's the exact words. It's quite wonderful. Bambook, on the other hand, was accused of riding in his quarters. No detail is really given there other than he was riding in his quarters. Just think about that. And acting in the prejudice of good order and military discipline, and also for behaving unbecoming the character of an officer and a gentleman. Now, the court found Galway not guilty of the charges levied against him owing to the lack of evidence, so he was acquitted. Cornet Bambook was found not guilty of the first charge, that being that riding in quarters, but he was found guilty of the second, and that he should be cashiered from the army. However, the commander-in-chief of the army in Ireland himself ordered the 14th Light Dragoons commanding officer to acquit Bambook, stating that the Lord Lieutenant, so then the C&C's superior, was pleased to pardon the cornet after the court of the court-martial had recommended mercy be shown owing to the young man's youth and his offer to resign his commission. Daily duties and a little bit of the daily life that these men would be experiencing in camp. And again, it's all there in the book. And I've picked a few little pieces from what were written down as daily duties, as well as other pieces of information I've garnered through the 2 volumes. But a typical day would start with reveille being beat by the drummer. You'd have a morning gun being fired at sunrise. So if the drums didn't wake you, the gun would. Recruits would have to be exercised twice daily. In the morning, we'd be looking at between 5 and 8 in the morning, and in the afternoon between 4 and 7. The guards, which there'd be your various guards and of pickets and guards outside the commanding officer's tents and the adjutant general's tent, these would be gathered together at 8 a.m. to parade, and all the officers would have to attend that parade each morning. Regimental surgeons would have to attend their sick twice a day. On the horse front, we had things like the commanding officer of the cavalry regiments, as well as the infantry regiments, because they had their horses too for their officers and for their pulling their munitions wagons and other wagons. But the COs of these regiments would have to pay particular attention to inspect the horses for glanders. And if discovered, sadly, the horses would be put to death because glanders can be very infectious, and even so much so to humans as well. So it's very much a feared scourge amongst the camps. All officers lately appointed, so new officers coming into the camp, would be taught the exercise of the firelock. This is the musket or fusel in the case of officers. And they would also be trained in the exercises of the spontoon, typically today referred to as a spontoon. Regimental chaplains would have to view their sick at least once a week. Speaking of chaplains, nothing more important in a camp than they would have to lead the Sunday services. And then to end out the day, an evening gun would be fired at sunset. Returns, nothing more important to an orderly army than returns. This being where a form such as these that I'll delve into in a moment, the idea being the information would be put in and then it would be returned to the commanding officers or the adjutants and whatnot in the orderly rooms, which the word orderly gets used in all sorts of different ways. This is an orderly book. You have an orderly room where the orderly sergeants maintain all of this documentation. So British Army is wonderful because everything is written down. And thanks to our library, we have a lot of these wonderful documents. So even though it is from 1778. And so let's delve into these returns. so these aren't completed returns, these are templates. So in this document, Cunningham and his team have written out these templates that then would be disseminated through the various officers in the Clonmel Camp, that then this is what they wanted them to copy and then fill in, which is just lovely. Again, we don't have that data here in this form, but we have what they're expected to complete. So what we have on the top left, we have an ammunition return. So this is where such details would be entered as the amount of pounds of gunpowder that were currently in store, the number of flints. So these are all flintlock weapons that would be being fired at the time. So the flint is the all-important, or one of the all-important aspects to make a gun fire. So the number of flints was to be recorded, as well as the number of firelocks, firelock being a contemporary name for muskets and fusils and carbines. So a number of the firelocks, number of the bayonets being recorded, as well as the state of the condition of said firelocks and bayonets. So there's different columns there that they'd be able to put whether they needed maintenance, or if they were in great condition, or if they were unserviceable at that time. Oh, in the bottom right, we have a morning regimental return, as in the morning of the day. So it was expected that each regiment in camp would send in their morning return, which was effectively a personnel list in just numbers, but it's a return of the numbers that are fit for duty that given morning, how many of the men were sick in hospital, how many had deserted, how many were injured. And on the far right, as you're looking at it, you have an adjoining section which focuses on the food and forage rations of that particular regiment. And it would be looking at things like the bread, the hay, and the oats. So you've got the horses and the men being looked at there. Here we have a recruiting return. What I very much think is probably the most charming out of these three. And that is, so recruiting return, this is the idea. You have your recruiting parties that would go out to the towns and villages, base themselves out of a pub or a tavern, which I won't get into all that, but there's a lot of stories of that. And it breaks down, they're wanting to know, how many men and officers are involved in that particular recruiting party. In terms of the men, it'd be looking at the ranks. So you get there, the corporals, sergeants, the drummers, which are all important to trying to create a fuss in town, to create the draw for people to come in and see what's going on. Where they were stationed, so that's looking at what town or village. And then, of course, most importantly, how many men were being recruited. So all of that is being spelled out for the officers to then write down that information. So what can an orderly book such as this tell us? Well, it's very much the importance in the late 1770s that the British Army placed in order, routine, and structure, and how this information was disseminated. That is the point of an orderly book, as Carrington or one of his staff put out so eloquently at the beginning of the book. And it's very much a glimpse of the daily life of British officers and men in this particular camp in Ireland, but it would have been very much similar in all the camps on the home front during this period of the American Revolution. Thank you for your attention. And if you have any questions in person or on Zoom, I will be happy to address them to the best of my ability. Very good question. So with the men that were based at Clonmel, were they local men? Would they been from elsewhere? How does maybe that tie in with this recruiting narrative that I was mentioning? That is an excellent question. And so the British Army was very much a multinational army, no matter where they were, no matter where they were stationed or where they were operating. At this period, and it varies from regiment to regiment, and it even doesn't matter if your regiment has Ireland or Scotland or England in the name. It typically doesn't matter. So the breakdown roughly for the men in this period is about 16% of the British Army was Irish, something like 20% was Scottish, and then the remainder were English. So and then with the officers, it gets flipped around a little bit in terms of you get a skew. It's very interesting with the officer class because you'll get more Irish and Scots than should be there based on the population disparities between the three main nations. Wales doesn't ever get mentioned because it's kind of the first colony. But anyway, I'm sorry if you're Welsh. But Welsh and Wales never gets any recognition really until much later on in so really the 20th century. Anyway, empire, it's all really jovial. But yes, so yes, so they're coming from everywhere, and then their regiment would then be posted to Ireland, and then they were then sent where they were sent. In the history of the 18th century in the British Army, it tended to be if you were based in, say, Dublin for long enough, you'd end up be recruiting from Dublin. Then they would move along and go to the next town. They'd be recruiting from that area. So it ended up reflecting that town in some ways, but it very much depended on where they were and how long they were there for any one time. So yeah, it would have been a whole mixture of guys. Any other questions? Yes.
How many British camps have been run once they were here? They have resembled the template that we see here in Clonmel, or the description of daily life.
Very good question. So how would these kind of camps in the British Isles home front, how does that equate to what would have been seen and experienced in North America during the Revolutionary War? My impression is by and large it's the same, though there would have been there's a real focus in this orderly book to pickets and guard duties. All of that would have been to the nth degree when it came to then being in a war zone. There would have been much more detail and a focus on that. Maybe not necessarily in the writing, but certainly in reality, there would have been that much more fear of American scouting parties. And then also foraging would have been much more talked about. And here you've got a supply system in place because you're on the home front. You're having sutlers come into camp as well, who are selling their wares. All of that is very strictly controlled, yes, but when you're talking about the American front, it's a case of food is much more scarce. You get the famous foraging war of New Jersey, New York, and so where men are literally going out to forage for food for the unit, for their camp. They're under the constant threat of enemy action. That's often happening. Men are getting captured, men are getting killed and injured. Whereas usually that is something you don't have to worry about on the home front. I have to say usually because these things happen. But usually the disturbances that the Brits are dealing with at home would be civil magistrates calling them out to put down a riot, which happens anywhere, whether it's England or Ireland or Scotland. And still it's more in a structured bubble, if you like, than it would. Everything was much more unpredictable here as opposed to there. Yes, so good question. Are there other orderly books and other documents from the British Army here? I am guilty of being a museum person, but I do believe we have at least another orderly book that's British. We have a much greater collection of orderly books relating to the Continental Army. That being said, there are some wonderful pieces that fill into this narrative of the British Army at home and overseas in our manuscript collection, which I was delving into to help supplement what I'm talking about here. One of which I'll just mention because it was very exciting. We have a report written by a commanding officer from the infantry, Dundas, which I assume is the same Dundas that writes the first British Army drill manual in the 1790s, and you get the Dundas drill based on Prussian teachings. But anyway, what he's doing here is writing a report of Ireland and what they can better do to prepare the Kingdom of Ireland from French invasion, and how they're planning on how he would. This is all a paper exercise, and then he's putting it forward at the end, basically to his superiors to say, "This is how I would do it." But it's absolutely wonderful. And that's very much just a small example of some of our holdings here. And it's bound within a bound volume of 15 different manuscripts from different periods of the British Army, delving into reports, letters, all sorts of things. So yes. So I believe my colleague Andrew has some questions from Zoom, so I'll take those now. Oh, so I sadly I can make it. It's an easy answer to that. So the question was, has this orderly book been digitized, and or has it been reproduced in any way? And the answer to both is no. And that's something we're regularly looking to do, is digitize our collections as and when we can. This piece just, it hasn't got there yet. I should say, I didn't say it, that came to us in 2010. That was a purchase for the library collection in 2010. Yes, sir. Yes. Shall I still repeat that question? Okay. So the question the question was, were the viewer was asking if two particular were they both commanding officers? Oh. Okay, so we've got two Matthews, one a commanding officer and one a general officer, and were their names in this particular book. I should say I've scoured the majority of this work. There's still a lot more that I haven't delved into, so I can't say for sure. And then the second part of that is it accessible to researchers? Absolutely. So you just contact someone from our library team. Best way is to look at our email for our staff on our website, and please come on down. You just make an appointment and you're welcome to come down and look at any of our collections. We try and make it as accessible as possible. And then, yeah, you get to experience the joy I've had this week of delving into that book, which again, it's really, really fun. Yeah, so I don't know for sure. I assume they were stationed in Ireland, and that's probably the reason for that question, but I don't know. Oh, they were. Oh, near Clonmel. Oh, fun. Yeah, I don't know. And again, this is only that little snippet of, what's that, about 12, 13 months. But yeah, I mean, certainly if you wanted to email me as well, please do so if I can help with that. Yeah. Oh, does the orderly book record any casualties? Not that I've seen. And again, it's an interesting one. So in a way, I didn't really hit that on its head, where a lot of this doesn't deal with what has happened. It's what should happen. So this orderly book is very much, these are the orders, disseminate these, but you're not getting what has happened, which is maybe not as satisfying as we'd ideally like in some ways, but it's also very interesting in its own way. And again, that dissemination of orders is very, very interesting. And it's kind of, again, that ideal of what they are after knowing, and presumably what they're expecting to know, because this is happening every day. And someone like our Adjutant General, he's been in the army like 30 odd years by this point, so he's presumably not expecting the world by asking for these things. They were used to doing it. Oh, is our library catalog available online? good question. And I was, yeah, I didn't say that. Yes, it is. Our library catalog is online. Some of the digitized materials, again, this isn't digitized currently, but a lot of our digitized material is available online. And then the library catalog, which is a much fuller run of the catalog, is available online, which then you can do keyword searches and things like that to find what you're looking for. And that's how I found that book, was I looked up something to do with Ireland, which I can't remember now, and found that by chance. And it's been kind of a little treasure for me. All right, it sounds like that's us. So for those of you in person, please come up. We can look through the book together if you'd like. The handwriting is exquisite and mostly pretty legible. So it's made that easy for me. But yeah, thank you so much for coming. Those of you online, thank you for joining us. I hope you can tune in soon for a future program. But thank you.